Thank you all for being here. Been really impressed with the quality of the conversation that's been taking place so far this morning. The organization I run in Washington is called the Washington International Trade Association, and we're the membership association for the trade community, mostly based in Washington, but our membership is made up of trade professionals in the U.S. government, in the private sector, and law firms. We have actually about 15% of our membership are the embassy staff who come to Washington and join to learn and be educated about international trade. So I love to see the kind of dialogue that we're having in Washington being replicated here in Nebraska and elsewhere. It's incredibly important. We have seen the interest in trade, as has been discussed a little bit already today, increasing incredibly in the past few years. Our membership has nearly doubled since President Trump came to office. It's good for, as a membership organization, it's been good for our business, not something we were necessarily looking for, but a lot of people are trying to understand this new direction of trade because it's honestly a reversal of decades of the direction we were headed, which was highlighted earlier today. We have two terrific discussants here today, two friends of my organization, WTO, as well as of the Institute. John Weeks is an illustrious career with the Canadian government. He's a Deputy Minister for Trade, a Chief Negotiator for the NAFTA, Ambassador for Canada to the World Trade Organization, and worked in Geneva for many, many years, very familiar with the World Trade Organization and the trade system. And Warren Maruyama, another old friend, has held important roles in the U.S. government for many years, was in the General Counsel's office under President Reagan, working with the now U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer. He was in the White House Economic Policy Office of George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, and the General Counsel at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office under President George W. Bush. And I think between their experience, both in the years leading up to the Uruguay round, in negotiating the Uruguay round, and in implementing the Uruguay round, and then the first years, especially through till today, of the World Trade Organization and its activities and jurisprudence, wealth of knowledge here on the stage. I've been privileged to have worked alongside of both of them or in parallel with them in my career. I mentioned I worked for Senator Rockefeller. He was the John D. Rockefeller IV, so the great-grandson of the original John D. Rockefeller, but he left New York and moved to West Virginia, and where he became first Secretary of State, governor, and then a U.S. Senator for several terms, and was sitting on the U.S. Senate Finance Committee during when the Congress was considering the Uruguay round, and we talked about that was the legislation, the agreement that was reached to create the World Trade Organization. And in the United States, the U.S. had to pass a very large piece of legislation to implement all the commitments that were made to join the World Trade Organization. I was working on that legislation, and I was joking with Warren that the two people who were whispering in my ear when I was trying to represent the interests of West Virginia were some steel companies at the time, and their representatives was, one was a guy named Alan Wolf, who's the current Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and the other one was Bob Lighthizer, who was representing steel interests and was I spoke to frequently. So many of the critiques that we're hearing today, which we'll hear about, have been tabled for many years, from the time when Warren was working in the George W. Bush White House. Even before that, Bob was talking about some of the concerns with the dispute settlement body. So a lot of the concerns that have been raised about the WTO are longstanding. They're not new. There's a lot of well-formed critiques. U.S. has written many papers, submitted to Geneva on this topic, but we're going to start by going back to the beginning. Warren's going to give us a little background on what led up to the Uruguay round and the creation of the WTO. Then we'll have John jump in and give some more context and background, and then we'll get into more of the discussion. Warren?
First of all, I'd like to thank Clayton Yeutter and Jill for organizing this, Ken for the introductions. It's an honor to be here today for the inaugural conference of the Yeutter Institute. I was privileged to work with Clayton Yeutter for 25 years, first at USTR, briefly on the White House staff, and then at Hogan Lovells. And I think of Clayton as a teacher and a mentor, and I also think of him as someone who really is what makes America great, that a boy could grow up in a small town in Nebraska, compile a brilliant record at this great university, and then go on to reach the absolute pinnacles of the US government as President Reagan's US Trade Representative and President George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Agriculture. Now, as I think most of us know, getting a job is one thing. The next challenge after you get it is doing something with it. And if you're in the government, it's also staying out of trouble, or in some cases, staying out of jail. Clayton, as I think many of the people in the room know, was a man of vision and also a man of action. And he compiled, not just because we're here today, but I think by any measure, just an incredible record in government service. Even before he entered government, and for 3 decades before and during his period as Secretary of Agriculture, he was part of reshaping American agriculture from something that was dependent on price supports, government checks, and Section 22 import protection into something that was export-oriented and has driven into global markets in a way that makes us the envy of the world. As U.S. Trade Representative, he launched the Uruguay Round and brought agriculture, intellectual property, and services into the GATT WTO rules-based system. He negotiated the U.S.-Canada agreement, which paved the way for the North American Free Trade Agreement and effectively created our first and third largest agricultural export markets and our 2 largest trading partners. And finally, he cracked the code in the U.S.-Japan beef agreement. We now export $2.1 billion worth of beef to Japan annually, and he set the template for how to address Japanese market access issues that Darcy Vedder and others followed in TPP. He would have been, I think, incredibly proud to see all of us here today. There is a real lack of understanding of trade issues among the public. I remember back to my first staff meeting at USTR that a lot of the terminology is complete gobbledygook, and I went out right afterwards and headed down to the Georgetown Law School bookstore and bought John Jackson's World Trade and the Law of GATT, which was a very long read. But you know, these issues, as we're seeing today, if you boil them down, are real dollars and cents issues for big and small US companies, for American households, and especially for American farmers. Like a lot of things, American trade policy has been shaped by the past. Under our Constitution, the principal responsibility over trade was given to the Congress, and for roughly 150 years, US trade policy consisted of Congress passing various tariff bills. If the northern states dominated the Congress, they wanted to protect their infant industries, so tariffs were high. If the South dominated the Congress, it wanted access to foreign markets for cotton and tobacco, and it also wanted access to English manufacturers, so tariffs were lower. That got out of hand in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, when Congress jacked US tariff rates to roughly 60% on average. And not unsurprisingly, it led to a collapse of global trade, a sharp decrease in US imports, but the entirely predictable consequence was an equivalent drop in US exports. And on the right-hand side, you can see the downward spiral in global trade. It wasn't the only factor, but it was a contributing factor to the Great Depression that left 1/3 of all Americans out of work and long lines of people lined up in soup kitchens. After that, Congress was scared about its propensities in delving too deeply into the trade area and started delegating the authority to the president. First to President Roosevelt in the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, which still remains, I think, the basic model. And ever since then, since 1934, U.S. tariffs have been set through negotiations with our trading partners. First in a series of bilateral agreements, but then after World War II, with the U.S. in the dominant position, the only country that came through with its economy intact, we were basically in a position where we could drive the shape of a lot of the global trading system. And what American policymakers, particularly Secretary of State Cordell Hull, were focused on was multilateral trade liberalization, an open, non-discriminatory, rules-based system, partly because we'd been aggrieved by the UK's tariff preferences that cut us out of a lot of markets, an expansion of US exports and investment, which has always been one of the core underlying goals, reciprocal market access, not in a very narrow sense of our tariff has to match your tariff for cars, but in a broader sense that what we got out of trade deals had to be roughly matched by what our trading partners were giving us. And finally, one wrinkle that's unique to the United States, which is legal enforcement or dispute settlement mechanisms, since we've always been concerned about whether our trading partners would comply. And that led to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, to 5 rounds of GATT negotiations that brought tariffs from roughly 50% down to around 5%, at least in industrialized countries. A Tokyo round where the sort of baby step into non-tariff barriers, and then Clayton's Uruguay round where we went full scale and really brought agriculture, intellectual property, and services into the GATT WTO system. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
John, I know you were working right alongside as we were heading to the late 80s, early 90s. U.S. and Canada are negotiating first a U.S.-Canada agreement, and then there's a NAFTA agreement, and all the while these Uruguay round negotiations are taking place, and you're right in the middle of that.
Well, I feel, thank you. And let me just say thank you to the Institute for inviting me, and I must say I'm very impressed by the quality of the discussion I've heard so far this morning. This is a great event, and I think there needs to be more discussion in the United States, but also in other countries like Canada, on these sort of matters because they're so critical at this point in time. I had the privilege of actually seeing Clayton Yeutter in action as a Canadian official. I was a frequent participant in the meetings of trade ministers between the United States, the EU, well then the EC, Japan and Canada that were described by Ted in his masterful introductory lecture. And in those events, you know, there were only 6 or 7 people for each country in the room, so there were enough people that you actually could get a sense of knowing even somebody who was much more senior. And I must say, I was extremely impressed with Ambassador Yeutter, with his skill, his intellect, and the way he was able to marshal things so that they actually happened. And yet he was a very open and friendly person. He was somebody, he always remembered my name. I remember being impressed by that when I come to the next quadrilateral trade ministers meeting. He said, "Hello, John, how are you?" So I guess he was a good politician as well. So it's roughly 35 years ago that Clayton Yeutter became the United States Trade Representative. And I'd like to go back and just elaborate a little bit on that period that Warren has just outlined. But 35 years ago, in a sense, Clayton Yeutter and his predecessor, Bill Brock, as United States Trade Representative. He became the trade representative in 1981, I think it was. They faced a world in which it wasn't as bad as today, but there were a number of very difficult problems. First of all, the US was running a chronic trade deficit. I remember listening to American officials say, this was unprecedented, it couldn't be sustained. Of course, it was nothing like the size of the one today, but it was still seen as being a very large problem. There was, and this helped feed protectionist pressures in Congress. There was a lot of draft legislation to take various protective actions. It led to the voluntary export restraint negotiations on imports from Japan that was described earlier this morning. And the GATT was seen as being out of touch with reality in a not dissimilar way to what people are now saying about the WTO. So the GATT at that time basically just dealt with tariffs and quotas and provided certain other key rules like the most favored nation treatment and national treatment. But essentially it had a very limited purview in terms of the various areas that it covered. It had begun to get into non-tariff barriers, but it was really just the beginning of what it did in that space. And there were 3 areas, and Warren touched on them very quickly, that the WTO didn't really touch at all: services, intellectual property, and agriculture. And Bill Bryce, I had an interesting chat with Bill Brock at a meeting of CSIS about 2 years ago. I got invited, I was an NAFTA negotiator for Canada. I've been invited to a lot of meetings since President Trump came to a lot more meetings than I had been in the preceding 4 years. So, it's an ill wind that blows nobody good. But anyway, so I started talking with Bill Brock about that period that I remembered and his role in moving matters forward. And he told me a story that when he first came to USTR, he arrived at the building and he said, "Who's the smartest guy you've got here? I want to sit down and have a chat with him." Well, there was somebody in USTR, Geza Fekete, who was sort of the idea man in a sense in the organization at that time. I worked with him a lot in the OECD Trade Committee on trade matters. And so Bill Brock said he sat down with Geza very quickly, and he said to Geza, "Tell me, what are we missing in the GATT?" And Geza Fekete said, "Intellectual property, services, and actually he said investment too." And in a way, all 3 of these things got picked up in the trade agenda in the coming years. As a practical matter, the investment one really got dealt with in the NAFTA context and then in other bilateral trade agreements because of reasons I won't go into in this brief intervention. Maybe it's not brief enough. But the other 2, Bill Brock, initially, with strong support from the American business community, really looked at how do you begin to get trade and services and intellectual property matters built into the trade rules in a way that responded to what was then seen as the realities of doing modern business in the 1980s. And I think in many ways we're at a similar point now. People are saying, well, the WTO is fine, but in some ways it's got shortcomings, but it also doesn't cover enough issues. E-commerce hadn't been invented when we were negotiating the WTO agreements or the NAFTA. So agreements require updating and expanding. In the GATT ministerial meeting in 1982 was where these issues were first really introduced into the WTO, into the GATT agenda, and then led to a lot of bruising discussions with many members opposed to the idea of bringing these matters into what was then the trade organization. And, but by 1986, after a lot of work and hard slogging and building up of a consensus by the United States and a number of its close allies in the trade field, it was possible to get these ideas, still over objections even at the meeting in Punta del Este that led to the launch of the Uruguay round, put on the agenda. And of course, by the time the result came out, in 1993, when the final elements of the agreement were put together, these issues were built into the trading system. And that, of course, has set the template also for what's been put into all of the various bilateral and regional agreements that have been negotiated since that time as well. Now, why did people decide to create a World Trade Organization? Ken's asked me to talk to this point, and I must say, when I reflected on it, I thought that's a really good question to ask right now, because I think it's relevant to a lot of the things that people are worried about and thinking about. And first of all, there was no grand design. People didn't sit down and say, how can we develop an overarching, intrusive, powerful organization that will sort of run the world trading system? That's not how we got there. We got there on a very incremental basis. First of all, the old GATT was actually only being applied on a provisional basis. It was set up in 1947 after the collapse of efforts to create an international trade organization at the end of the Second World War, sort of like the IMF and the World Bank, the third leg of this stool. And I think it's worth noting that it was the failure, really, of the United States Congress to want to consider this that meant this agreement to create an international trade organization didn't go anywhere, and out of that was salvaged the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which, as I said, was applied provisionally, but just as an executive legislative agreement, not as a treaty, so that the Congress never had to consider it. So it kept a very low profile. One of the problems with that, it was a kind of weak institutional footing, and it also had a provision that anybody could withdraw from it on 60 days' notice. Well, by the time we got 40 years on, it was pretty clear that this agreement was rather important, and people thought it had to be put on a stronger footing. By the way, it was also the sort of committee that had the theoretical legal authority over the GATT, was the interim committee for the International Trade Organization, which actually was a committee of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. So this was a pretty unusual animal, and people thought it's time we set up an organization on its own right that's not associated with the United Nations that would deal with trade issues. And the final reason was really the most dominant reason that led to the formation of the trade. It was, by the end of the Uruguay round, it was becoming clear that we developed new disciplines on services, new disciplines on intellectual property. We developed the trade policy review system that was talked about earlier. And Arthur Dunkel, the then Director General of the GATT, began saying to people, how do you fit this into the GATT? This goes beyond the scope of what is covered by the GATT. We need a new sort of institutional structure as a practical matter to handle that. And so people began thinking, well, we need a new structure, and it got called a number of things, and then it was eventually called the World Trade Organization. I think that people afterwards, and some people maybe at the time, have greatly overestimated what the sort of powers are of the World Trade Organization as an organization. It was something that was set up to deal with practical problems, and I've often said that it's really just an international agreement masquerading as a trade organization. So I was ambassador to the GATT during the Uruguay round. I was then ambassador to the WTO from 1995 to 1999. And I didn't notice any really different institutional behavior, really, in terms of how the GATT operated and the WTO operated, except, and this may surprise you, that it was much harder to organize a good policy discussion among countries in the WTO than it was in the GATT. Now, the other thing that Ken asked me to talk about is how did we decide that we needed a dispute settlement understanding and an appellate body? How did we get to that point?
And I think, just jumping, I think I want to get that this is the crux of the issue we're facing right now. This is, if any of you have heard about the crisis at the WTO, it's about the dispute settlement body and the maybe larger than anticipated or hoped for by some of the drafters role it has played and taken in the center of the WTO. So with John.
So first of all, let me say thank you, and I think you're absolutely right. And first of all, there was no grand design here. People didn't sit down and say, how do we develop a new judicial system for international trade? This negotiation began in one of the normal negotiating groups in the Uruguay round as an effort to say, how do we look at addressing some of the practical problems that have been found in dispute settlement under the GATT? There was in the previous round, the Tokyo round, a dispute settlement understanding that was negotiated that really tried to look at, are there some ways of codifying the existing practice that had developed over the years in terms of how disputes were settled in the GATT, how panels were established, how they worked, and so on. So essentially what happened is this process was carried forward in the working group to sort of say, how do we update this and deal with other problems that had emerged in the working of the system? The biggest problem that had emerged was that in the old panel system in the GATT, a panel would finish its work and then it would be submitted to the then GATT Council, which was the sort of ruling body of the GATT, and for adoption. And a lot of these reports were adopted for a number of years. But then in the Uruguay round, we got to the point, partly I think it was because people were jockeying to maintain leverage in negotiations, but we got a long line of panel reports, good reports for the most part, well analyzed and worked out, that countries didn't adopt. And they weren't adopted because the country against whom the findings were made decided they just didn't want to see it adopted right then. They were very careful not to say, they didn't say, we reject this report, this is outrageous. They said, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to say that we need more time to reflect on this. It raises a number of important you know the line. So, but the answer was no action at today's meeting, and given that these reports had to be adopted by consensus, nothing really happened. So people said, well, is there some way we can correct the system to allow panel reports to be more or less automatically adopted? And people said, yeah, but what if it's a bad report? What if it's egregious? So it was actually the Canadian delegation that suggested, well, maybe we could have some sort of appellate stage where you would have an appellate body or whatever it was called, I forget how we first described it, that would look at this and review the panel report with a different group of people sitting on it than the original panelists, and see if they concurred in the decision it had taken. And after that, the report would then go to the GATT Council. Well, it wasn't the GATT Council by the time we established the WTO any longer. It was a dispute settlement body. And there the situation would be reversed from what it was in the old GATT Council. It would be, unless there was a consensus not to adopt the report, it would be adopted. And so this worked quite well initially, but I think two things happened. One is, and this was described by Ted Alden, the negotiating function of the WTO atrophied. So the WTO was no longer addressing these pressing new issues like digital commerce and updating the rules on state trading, state-owned enterprises, these sorts of problems. And yet the appellate body was not being shy about going on and making findings and new interpretations of things that people never really remembered negotiating.
So, yeah.
So I have a lot of sympathy with the criticism that the Americans bring about the operation of the appellate body. I think the appellate body lost the plot, because I think a lot of the members who sit on the appellate body have essentially judicial backgrounds, very little understanding, or university professor backgrounds, as Warren reminded me before we began, and very little understanding of how trade agreements are actually negotiated or what was negotiated in the Uruguay round. So I think you really need to go back and look at what was negotiated. And I think it's important to remember, in trying to think of how to get ourselves out of the current mess, to think that the original purpose was to figure a practical way of making sure panel reports were adopted by the membership, not to try to create an elaborate judicial process that intruded in, it was perceived as intruding into the rights and obligations that had originally been negotiated. And let me say one other word too. You know, people talk about binding dispute settlement. There's also, binding means all sorts of different things. This is something that I find is really confusing in the WTO context, because when we say WTO dispute settlement is binding, we mean that once that interpretation is adopted by the dispute settlement body, that is the definitive interpretation of how the WTO rules apply in this particular case. It's not binding in the sense that the sheriff will be around later to arrest you if you don't comply. That process then goes on to permit the possibility of retaliation by other countries, but there's no way of actually enforcing that a government will decide to change its behavior because of a WTO finding. So retaliation, it's the same thing we're seeing now that was described in the sort of reaction of other countries to the 232 actions and the Chinese in the case of 301 actions. So it seems to me we need to go back and be more modest in terms, and a lot of people now in this discussion about how to change the appellate body have drunk too much of the Kool-Aid, I think, from various countries. So they think, you know, the system has to be preserved exactly as it is. There are very few people around who still remember why it was all put together in the first place and how. And I think if we go back and think about how it was put together, we may find it easier to find a solution to our current problems.
It's interesting, you know, I'm a history student myself, so I appreciate this lesson you've given us and taken us sort of to why we created the WTO and why initially we needed it. We felt there was a need for a DSB, a dispute settlement body, but then we'll start running into these problems. Bureaucracies tend to sometimes feed off themselves and make them bigger, and creating a new legal system was definitely not in the minds of people when we were drafting, I know, in the Congress, and I know when Bob Lighthizer was whispering in my ear about U.S. sovereignty 25 years ago, so I'm giving him a lot of credit for seeing some concerns around the corner. So then we jump in. We're in the WTO system, and then Warren, you're coming back into the government now in the Bush administration, and we're starting to see the WTO beast maybe growing and getting bigger and bigger. China's now entered in 2000 with its own set of time frames for entering, and its self-declaration of developing country status and all the issues that came with that. We're here today in 2019, but how did we get here in the last 20 years?
Well, the first thing is we have to scrub that tape so Bob Lighthizer never finds out that the appellate body was a Canadian idea. So what exactly changed? So that the GATT WTO system, which was regarded as really one of the pillars, along with the IMF and World Bank, as well, I won't say a joke, but it's fallen a long, long ways. The first was the effort to launch the Doha round, which was, I think from the very beginning, jinxed. The first mistake was to call it a development round, which gave the idea to a lot of the developing countries for whom it was a very beneficial and self-serving idea that they could get around for free. The second thing was, in the eagerness of some to do a round very quickly, they went for a minimalist agenda and did not take on some of the broader issues that were facing the trading system. It was a very limited agenda in the thought that maybe that would be easier. But as Clayton showed in the Uruguay round, going big is actually the way that you get real trade-offs and also the way that you get business and stakeholder interest. And there was absolutely no interest in the Doha round. The second thing is, John may disagree with this, but at least if you talk to US and European negotiators, what they'll say is that the prescription for completing a GATT round was the US and EU had to come to some sort of an agreement. That, I think, was already on its last legs.
I agree with this.
And the US and EU didn't help at the Cancun Ministerial, where they came up with a proposal on agricultural subsidies called the Blue Box, which basically did absolutely nothing except create a new box and move all of their most objectionable subsidies into it and say they couldn't be touched. And Brazil and others, quite properly, I think, blew a gasket and blocked the whole ministerial. And at that point, Doha became something of a salvage operation, and they pulled a couple of small bits and pieces. The trade facilitation agreement was completed. They're still talking about a services agreement. The ITA, Information Technology Agreement, was completed, and they're talking about an environmental goods agreement and a fisheries agreement. But this is really small potatoes. And what's happened also is that as an institution, the WTO has become increasingly dysfunctional. It's gotten to 164 members, which is great in the sense that there's a lot of interest in it. You've had a lot of countries come in. But it's also become an exercise in herding cats. The US, which has helped to drive most of the past GATT rounds, which drove the creation of the World Trade Organization, with the EU usually being one that was dragging its feet, and actually drove the Doha round under President Trump and Bob Lighthizer, has turned into a serious skeptic. So that leadership is now missing. We participate in the WTO in sort of a perfunctory way, but we're really not seriously engaged. And finally, the key developing countries who have a big stake in the system, and this would include countries like Brazil and China, have not really stepped up into a leadership role. You know, they're still in Doha obsessed with the idea of a round for free. They've allowed India to be their leading spokesman. India, under Gandhi, believed in import substitution, so they've got 700 million small subsistence farmers. They've got huge tariffs on all of their industrial products. So there's basically no way that India can do anything in terms of services or tariff liberalization. The only thing they want is free access for their information technology services. And so the focus shifted from WTO negotiations to regional trade agreements like TPP, or the EU-Canada agreement, the EU-Japan agreement, CPTPP, where Japan basically salvaged what was left of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in the middle of this, as Ed laid out, you have a big backlash against globalization and a discrediting of global elites because of the 2008 crisis. So I think the professors laid out some of the key elements of the WTO system, but just to provide a baseline of what we have and what's potentially at risk. Certain rules, like most favored nation, you can't discriminate between trading partners, national treatment, US goods when they go into a foreign country have to be treated the same as domestic goods for services and tax purposes, a prohibition on quotas with some limited exceptions, and the dispute settlement process. And then in the WTO, a major expansion. This is basically a first step, but bringing agricultural subsidies and market access under real disciplines. So that's contributed to the major increase in exports of US farm products. A general agreement on trade and services, again, a first step, but opening up markets to US services or locking in existing market access so it can't go backwards. a sanitary phytosanitary agreement, which has turned out to be one of the unexpected wins, but has really played a major role in blocking sanitary phytosanitary abuses, which were, as agricultural tariffs were coming out, you started to see SPS restrictions coming up, and that, I think, has been addressed through, to give the appellate body and the panel's credit, some pretty good decisions. An agreement on standards, again, an unexpected win. TRIPS on intellectual property has provided a baseline for intellectual property rights protection. And a dispute settlement understanding with the original idea being to stop the blocking of panel reports that John referenced. That blocking actually did have a major effect on the people in this room, because most of the blocking involved the EU blocking US wins on parts of the common agricultural policy. So,
We're going to try to pivot to get to the upsides, and then we can maybe take a few questions.
yep. So the upsides. What are the good things about the WTO? It sets a floor through MFN tariff bindings on what sort of tariffs a WTO member can set. It offers a predictable set of worldwide trade rules, and some of them, like national treatment, MFN, the restrictions on quotas, the SPS rules, are very, very useful. It supports transparency through notification processes and the trade policy review mechanism. And there are some issues that require a multilateral solution, and one of them is agricultural subsidies, because say if we and Japan were to agree to discipline agricultural subsidies as between us, that arguably is a form of unilateral disarmament if the EU and other countries, or China, are not part of that equation. So you really need a broad-based agreement if you're going to bring down agricultural subsidies. The dispute settlement system, whatever its flaws, is an alternative to trade wars. And as we've seen with the China stuff, trade wars are really ugly. No one wins them. And the WTO originally was a forum for broad-based multilateral negotiations. Those chugged along in a very incremental sort of way. But if you bring things down by 10%, 20% every 5 or 10 years, you go from 50% tariffs down to 5% tariffs. And finally, the WTO was a tool for a soft tool for pressure on China, which does not like being isolated in international organizations. And one situation in which China would actually move was in situations where the US, EU, and Japan, Canada, actually ganged up on them and told them they were outside the rules. So what then are the weaknesses and criticisms? It's no longer an effective negotiating body. Doha is absolutely dead in the water. That's been true for 10 years. The lowest common denominator in the WTO, just given the 164 members and the participation of countries like Russia, India, and China, the lowest common denominator is low, and it's getting lower. You have the appellate body overreaching. This is a concern that predated the Trump administration, and it goes into basically what I think is a bad case of hubris, where they've tried to take over the negotiating function of the WTO by what's called gap filling and taking on issues that were never negotiated and agreed. There's been, and this is something where Lighthizer and Trump are correct, an abuse of developing country status, which is self-designating. And so you've got Korea, Singapore, China, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, among others, claiming that they're developing countries. Transparency, a good thing, a better understanding, the precursor for any sort of educated trade negotiation is broken down. Countries are not notifying subsidies. And that has created a big problem, particularly with China. The GATT system was known for sort of good day-to-day processes through committees and working groups. That's broken down, and those things are basically dead in the water. And finally, the rules don't address some of the key Chinese practices. This would include things like massive industrial subsidies. that have created excess capacity in steel and aluminum, state-owned enterprises, which don't operate on terms of markets, but instead go off on government industrial planning, forced technology transfers, and currency manipulation. And just to close, Nebraska is one of the biggest exporting states at USTR. We always viewed the Nebraska congressional delegation as a reliable free trade vote. And one of the problems with the WTO is the lack of stakeholder support, and some of this is perfectly understandable. But if the WTO breaks down and we actually do pull out, agriculture is going to be the first in line to get targeted with tariff increases and trade barriers, just because every country has an agricultural sector, and in every country, farmers have disproportionate political power. And so a lot of the barriers before the Uruguay round involved agriculture, and some of the worst and most ugly disputes involved agriculture, and that is still true. But I guess unlike some of the other speakers, I don't think we're actually walking into the abyss. We're in serious trouble. But I think if there were an effort to pull out of NAFTA, if there were an effort to pull out of WTO, there would be a major pushback from American business and American agriculture once they started seeing what it actually meant. And Donald Trump would actually be at serious risk of becoming a one-term president. So I really don't think that's going to happen. But we do need people with Clayton's vision and ability to pull us out of this sinkhole, because otherwise, as Ted laid out, it's just going to get worse.
So I was thinking, Warren, as both of you were finishing up, we should have retitled our panel the World Trade Organization: The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But hopefully we can try to aim more towards the good. We don't have a ton of more time, but we would like to take a few questions if we have them. We have a mic runner. If folks can just identify themselves when they have a question, that would be super helpful. This lady right here.
And at one time, there was a structure in the WTO specifically for agriculture, and you mentioned the blue box. There was an amber box and a green box, a red box that's no longer used. Is that structure still in place?
John?
Well, in the agreement on agriculture, yeah, a lot of it's there. I think there's been some confusion about what was being negotiated in the Doha round that never happened, and what the pre-Doha round situation was. You know, in a very broad sense, the discipline, it was in the Uruguay round that was the first successful effort to agree internationally on some way of containing on a broad basis agricultural support programs in different countries. And, but it left the support at very high levels, just as the new disciplines on market access in agriculture left the tariffs at very high levels. So there was a really good framework established for how to move forward with further negotiations to improve the liberalization of agriculture. But unfortunately, we've stayed where we were with what was agreed in 1993, which is a while ago.
And the other problem is, I think the basics, as John said, the basic structure is still there, but you've seen some cheating, and that includes, the U.S. currently has a WTO dispute underway against China for not obeying the overall cap on its domestic subsidy programs. I don't know how
The United States won that.
It actually won? Oh,
Yeah, they won, and believe it or not, the panel report was adopted without appeal by China. It found against China.
Some good things happening. But I think the other question right now would be, and I haven't looked into this, how President's compensatory payments to U.S. farmers fit within the U.S. cap.
So looking this way, behind me, any questions over here? We got one right here. Yes. Please identify yourself when you ask the question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Barrett. I'm a third-year law student here. My question is regarding the Chinese practices that aren't addressed by the current WTO agreements. Are there any efforts to address those concerns, or is the U.S. the only one pushing for that?
I think those concerns are broadly shared by a lot of countries, including the EU, Japan, Canada. There is some effort to try and pull that together through something called the trilateral process that was organized by those three countries. I know there's been a lot of work on potentially new rules on industrial subsidies, but you know, one of the unfortunate things about the Doha round is it's wasted about 15 years, and you know, you would need to get those new rules captured in a WTO agreement. You would have to start a new round or some sort of plurilateral agreement that gets China in, get China to agree to the new rules, and you know, rounds typically take about 10 years.
I guess I'd also, you know, a couple points on that to add. Well, first of all, there's also ways to address Chinese behavior that were attempted through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was, I mean, it wasn't as upfront. People were not as upfront about what it was really about. Yes, it was an agreement between 13 countries, agreements that about half of which the United States had agreements with already. Brought Japan into a trade agreement for the first time. But what it was meant to isolate China. People didn't want to say that because it would have been very antagonistic to the Chinese, but it would have created a new set of rules about 40% of the global economy that China was not part of, and if they wanted to be, they were going to have to adopt new standards to be able to join that agreement in 10 or 15 years. Politicians didn't want to talk about that because they didn't want to say this is going to be an agreement and open the door to China. There was a lot of political reasons they didn't say that. The other thing that's happening is there are these plurilateral discussions that was just referred to, and that's coalitions of the willing. And there are agreements that are being discussed alongside the WTO and by members of the WTO to create agreements that the Chinese can try to be part of or not be part of, like the TPP. And that may be one other way of kind of influencing their behavior through working with our allies. The problem is, as we've talked about a bit, the current approach sometimes antagonizes our allies that we might otherwise want to be working with, like the Canadians, like the Mexicans, like the Europeans, of course, and some of our Asian allies, because we're picking fights with them instead on separate issues instead of working together at the WTO or in other forums. Right here.
Thank you. I'm Rick Goodman. I'm a professor in food science here, and I work on genetic technology of plants and other things. So a question from me, I'm not an economist. I look at dollars and cents, but not at the same level you're talking about. But I see non-tariff trade barriers as a real problem around the world, and that's related to things like genetically engineered crops. That is very important in Nebraska, and we have people on both sides of the issue. But clearly, China does not have a process that works for approval of genetically engineered crops. Europe has a very funny process. Africa, much of Africa, parts of Central America and South America are driven by the Cartagena Protocol, which is really pretty much an exclusionary process. And at some points, I thought the WTO was going to intervene. But what is a way out of this? And part of it is driven by industry, of course. Non-GMO. That's an interesting thought.
Well, we did win a case challenging Europe's GMO restrictions. The problem is that what it left in place is these approval processes for specific GMOs, and those can be abused. In Europe, you would have to say that a substantial part of this is not just protectionism. There is a major public backlash against GMOs, which somehow has to be addressed. In China, there's also a public backlash, but there also seems to be more manipulation of the system to just stall out GMO U.S. crops from entering their market.
And Canadian.
So I think we have time for one more brief question before we turn to lunch. Oh, good, right there. That'll be our last.
Yeah, Mark McCarg, a farmer in Central City, also Vice President of Nebraska Farm Bureau. I don't understand the system enough, but it's interesting to me that we have decided to agree to work within the parameters of WTO, but we just blatantly decide to just not do it. I mean, we're actively doing things that may not comply. And then probably one of the most concerning things was what you mentioned lastly, as a person involved in agriculture, that if we decided to just pull out of WTO, that would be very harmful for agriculture. So any things that you could offer that the agricultural sector could do to either shore up, I mean, if we just pull out, that seems detrimental. Is there any way to modify or guide the discussion in another way that we can potentially soften that blow if that's coming?
Could I say? I mean, I think that basically, I go back and think about the situation in the 1980s that I described. I think in a sense, there are a lot of things that are unsatisfactory about the way the WTO is now operating. There are new areas of trade that need to be added to it. We have to improve its functioning in a number of the areas it already addresses, like agriculture. But, for a variety of reasons, we haven't got there yet. I think we got to start now. I mean, unwinding it is not the right answer, because you'd have to replace it with something. So I think we have to look at how do we start moving forward? And it has to start with leadership from like-minded countries. And this is one of the unfortunate things I think about Donald Trump's approach to trade reform. You can't fault him for thinking there was something the matter with the Chinese system and the way it was operating. But to decide you're going to take on all your allies with punitive tariffs at the same time as you're trying to cooperate with them in dealing with China isn't a really good way to do it. I think when you look at the leadership that was provided by the United States in the early 1980s, first with Bill Brock as USTR and then with Clayton Yeutter, we got to go back to that sort of approach again and start really looking at how do we plan a way forward among like-minded countries that is going to actually change this system and improve the trade disciplines for producers and others in the economy. And I think that's going to take time, but it's the only way that I can see of doing it. And I happen to believe it's possible. And at the end of the day, I'm maybe going to say something. One of the things when we created the WTO, I didn't mention, is that in order to set up the WTO and not to have conflicting jurisdiction with the old GATT, it was decided that everybody would withdraw from the GATT and join this new organization. So everybody invoked the 60-day clause under the Protocol of Provisional Application and withdrew from the GATT. So if anybody wanted to participate in this new improved system, they had to join the WTO. Now, it was easier then. Everybody agreed by the time we got to the end of that negotiation that they wanted to go down that road. But I could imagine a situation in which you could work on developing a new system and there might be reluctance on the part of a few countries to move to that new system, and it might need a little tough love. And one of that would be to say, well, okay, we're moving to this new system, this new improved World Trade Organization or whatever it's called. And if you want to be part of that, fine, you have to sign up, but here's the terms. And if you don't want to be part of it, you're welcome to stay in the old WTO, but we're leaving.
So,
you won't have any rights or obligations with us.
Ward want to add something? Then we're going to wrap this up after that.
I think agriculture is in a really tough spot because you're an innocent bystander in a broader dispute. There are many things you can say that are very negative about Trump and Lighthizer trade policy, but on China, there's some very legitimate concerns about how the Chinese were behaving. The deficits were unsustainable. some of the practices like indigenous innovation and Made in China 2025, where they clearly aspired to push American technologies out of their market and, achieve global leadership, global dominance. Those were not something that I think we could put up with. And the mechanisms that had been used before, the high-level dialogues under the George W. Bush administration, under the Obama administration, really having participated in 3 of them, were completely unproductive. The WTO disputes, and I brought 5 WTO challenges against China, and we either won or settled on good terms, all of them, cut around the edges of the Chinese system and didn't go to some of these things like huge industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfers, which, as a number of people have pointed out, are not covered by WTO rules. The one thing I think, and I think a number of speakers have touched on this, that we could do better is to try and work with our allies instead of trying to take China on alone, which forces us, and particularly American farmers, to bear all of the costs of this sort of set of challenges that was coming at some point, one point or another. It's come now, but it would have been better if there had been an effort to try and fix TPP. It was a flawed agreement, but the problems were, political ones and probably could have been fixed. It would have been better not to get in trade wars with our allies by, claiming national security over steel and aluminum, something that is pretty shaky. And, all the retaliation, because everyone knows that agriculture is our political weak spot. All the retaliation, a lot of it was aimed at, American dairy products, American tree nuts, American soybeans. So working with our allies, getting more focused on the big problem, which is clearly China, and not getting in extraneous fights with our other trading partners and trying to work with them as allies, I think would give us a lot better chance of cornering China. And we do have to corner China on some of these issues.
Well, thank you to our discussants. Really interesting. I've learned a lot myself, and it's something I'm passionately interested in and follow a lot myself. I was writing some notes to myself. I may have caught me looking at my phone. I wanted to remind myself. But a great book that I read many years ago, and I recommend to all of you, is called President the Creation. It's Dean Acheson's memoirs, and he talks about the creation of the global systems that are in place right now, and all of those are under threat right now, not just the World Trade Organization. There's pressure on a lot of them right now. And if you believe the global markets, if you believe in global trade, if you believe that cooperation is a good thing, it's important for you all to have your voices heard by your members of Congress and others. And having sessions like this in Nebraska at the university, the Yeutter Institute is an amazing legacy to a great man. And the work to preserve and improve the global trading system, if that's something that this institute can be part of, I'm proud to be part of it myself. Thank you all.